Hi everyone. Welcome to the annual Parmoor lecture, sponsored by the Howard League for Penal Reform, and we are very, very glad to be partnering with them. And this is a fantastic occasion, and so great to see it so well attended. And I am not going to say anything further than invite Andrea to come up and speak. So thank you very much.
I'll introduce you first, Andrea, shall I? Sorry, Andrea, so many Andreas.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you. A huge thanks to Aitken for hosting this event and for their support over the year with various pieces of really quite extraordinary research that they've done for us. My name's Andrea Coomber. I delivered last year's Parmoor lecture. We're going with a theme where you have to have the name Andrea in order to deliver it. Lord Parmoor was a great supporter of the Howard League. He was the fourth Lord Parmoor, Milo Cripps. And it's once said that he was apparently in Oxford as a student, and either for his birthday or for his automobile's birthday, he filled up the tank with champagne. And I think that sort of sets off the stories you hear about Lord Parmoor, a kind of raconteur, fun person who was a banker, a antiquarian book dealer, a collector of botanicals, and most passionately a prison reformer and supporter of the Howard League. And we are hugely grateful for the legacy that he left us, which has transformed the ability of our charity to be able to work over the 10 years before I joined. Tonight we have a lecture followed for half an hour-ish, followed by an opportunity for questions. We are joined tonight by a good number of people online. So if those people could please, I think there are magic cameras up here somewhere. If those people could put any questions for Andrea into the Q&A box, I will monitor that. And there'll be an opportunity for people obviously in person to ask any questions. We'll then stop, and outside we will enjoy some refreshments. Thanks to Aitken Gump. Our Parmoor lecture tonight is being delivered by Andrea Albutt. Andrea is soon to be, which is outgoing from till March next year, the president of the Prison Governors Association, which, as you know, represents the views of prison governors who have a really important voice within the criminal justice system and on prison reform. Her tenure has been an interesting one, and she's going to talk about that. And she has very much been a forceful, plain-speaking voice over the time I've been the director of Chief Executive of the Howard League for a more commonsensical, humane, effective approach to prison policy. A former army nurse, Andrea became a prison officer. She was a prison officer in prisons like Wakefield, Brixton, Grendon, Wood Hill. She went on to govern a lot of prisons, some of them quite complicated places like Eastwood Park, Bristol, Low Newton, Swansea, before working in the centre of HMPPS, but for the last 8 years has been leading the prison governance. So please welcome to the podium, Andrea Albutt.
Evening. Thank you, Andrea, for inviting me to give this lecture. I hope I live up to expectations, but I'm sure it is very plain speaking. Forgive me if I keep stopping for some water. I'm just recovering from the usual seasonal cold, and I've got a bit of a hoarse voice. Anyway, my talk to you focuses on a prison system from 2010 to present day. I don't want to sound political or be critical of a specific party, but unfortunately, this period covers the tenure of the Conservative Party. Their policy of austerity 10 years ago has left such a deep and lasting wound for prisons and other public services that this period cannot be glossed over. We have yet to recover from such financial cuts. I want to show you how short-termism, party politics, constant changing of secretaries of state and personal ministerial priorities have left a system feeling like a political football with little evidence of sustained improvement and often a legacy of dire consequences for all who live and work in prisons. This is my honest reflection of a prison system over the last 13 years. I gave an address to the all-party parliamentary group on penal affairs in the Houses of Parliament in June of this year, cataloguing the disastrous impact government policies had on the prison system since 2010. With the exception of one or two of the MPs in attendance and those in the public seats, it was not warmly received. In fact, it was received with a bit of stunned silence. I would have hoped that this group, who allegedly have a keen interest in the penal system, would have shown more interest and emotion. I won't bore you with the suggestions put forward for them to make it better. It was so embarrassingly low level and nondescript that I felt utterly deflated. They had no idea of the reality of our situation. Sadly, I am of the firm belief that our political masters do not have a hunger to make our beleaguered service better, as we're not vote winners. The PGA is an apolitical organisation, as am I in the role of president. I listen to the rhetoric of other parties, and unfortunately, the tough on crime mantra follows the same pattern. We're on our own to make a difference in what is the most challenging of times, regardless of who governs the country. In 2010, Justice Secretary Ken Clarke inherited a prison service, not perfect by any means, but performance was good, stability was good, and self-inflicted deaths, whilst never wanted, were low. Breaking the Cycle, Effective Punishment, Rehabilitation and Sentencing of Offenders was published in June 11, promising to end inefficiency and bureaucracy and make prisons places of hard work and training. Men and women would be expected to work a 40-hour week with money being deducted from these earnings to support victim groups. Access to illicit drugs would be addressed with tighter security, and those in prison with drug addiction would be placed on drug recovery wings to address the scourge of the habit. This all sounded very promising, but initiatives like these require money and investment, both in infrastructure and people to deliver them. Mr. Clarke, at this time, was expected to make cuts due to the substantial reduction of the Ministry of Justice budget agreed with the Chancellor, so it was never going to be fully funded. Some money was forthcoming, but not enough to deliver such widespread change. Only a small number of prisons had workshop places which could accommodate prisoners working 40 hours a week. Most jails dabbled in these concepts, but with little verve and commitment because it was an almost impossible task. This ministerial priority stopped when Mr. Clarke was replaced by Chris Grayling. In July 2011, Mr. Clarke announced a competition strategy for 9 existing prisons, 8 of which were public sector. This process duly began with the usual private companies and public sector deciding to bid for all prisons at significant cost to the public purse. Little did we know that this was the real start of the race to the bottom to achieve stringent cuts with far-reaching consequences for prisons. In 2012, Chris Grayling came into the ministry with a clear agenda of reducing costs further whilst bringing in reform. His May 2013 Transforming Rehabilitation, a strategy for reform, was very much built on through the gate services, ensuring there was consistency between custody and community. A laudable concept and one which was right. In simple terms, this is how it translated into policy. National Probation Service, as we knew it, would be disbanded. Those people serving 12 months or less would now get supervision on release through the private community rehabilitation companies. Resettlement prisons would be created, and men and women in prison would be located or returned to these prisons and benefit from through the gate services. The highest risk offenders would continue to receive supervision from the much smaller National Probation Service. The policy was implemented with dangerous consequences for prisons and has since been fully reversed at a significant cost to the public purse. Research shows that a younger population and high churn increases instability in prisons. We all know that the initial few weeks of first reception to prison are the riskiest, with violence, self-harm and suicide most likely to happen. Transferring between prisons has the same effect on individuals. In creating resettlement prisons, churn increased significantly, and as it included 18 to 21-year-olds, the age profile became younger within these establishments. Furthermore, due to supervision of previously unsupervised under 12-month sentenced offenders, the level of recall to prisons increased, creating a further churn previously not seen. In essence, a policy decision was implemented which contributed to the downward spiral of instability, although other factors came along which created the perfect storm. Prison competition came to a halt under Chris Grayling's tenure. Public sector bids during the process showed that NOMS, National Offender Management Service, as we used to be called, believed they could run safe, secure and decent prisons far more competitively, so competition was stopped. A policy decision was made to benchmark all public sector prisons, massively reducing cost per prisoner place, with the savings being delivered virtually immediately, unlike contracted prisons, whose savings tended to be at the back of long contracts. The sword of Damocles was waved over our heads, saying this is the only way forward to stave off privatisation and it must be done. This was very palatable to government, who needed to cut spending across the public sector. The much maligned and justifiably so prison benchmarking began. The race to the bottom was in full swing. The decision by Chris Grayling to compete facilities management was proven to be expensive and disastrous, with the prison estate worsening due to unresponsive contractors and lack of funding. The crumbling estate became so dilapidated that large parts of it were unfit for human habitation, but remained in use. To date, large parts of the prison estate remain squalid and incapable of providing an environment which is safe, decent or rehabilitative. Implementation of benchmarking from 2012 to 2017 led to demonstrable deterioration in outcomes, particularly safety. Numbers of frontline HMPS operational staff were cut by 31% between 2010 and 2017. There was no corresponding reduction in the prison population. To reduce excess staff at speed, a voluntary early departure scheme was implemented across all grades with significant take-up. This resulted in prisons losing thousands of years of experience and associated destabilising effect it created. The recruitment tap was turned off. There was to be no new staff employed. Rates of assaults in prison increased by almost 150% over the same period, with assaults on staff increasing by over 250%, self-harm incidents rising by 120%, and unplanned use of force more than doubling in this period. To this day, we have not recovered from the catastrophic reduction in funding, and once again, violence statistics are on an upward trajectory and heading towards record-breaking 2014-15, which is incredibly worrying. I was governor of HMP Bristol when we implemented austerity. My prison officer numbers were cut by 40, but the work they were required to do remained the same. The number of prisoners remained the same. It was not just officers on the landings which were reduced. Office functions, which provided them administration for prisoners, were reduced. Security and intelligence officers were reduced, to name but a few. The whole system ground to a halt, causing frustrations to everyone living and working in prisons. At around the same time, we were introduced to spice, this terrible synthetic drug which pervaded all our prisons, causing violence at a level never seen before, death and destruction. As we did not have the staff to manage such a thing, either from gathering intelligence through good staff-prisoner relationships and ability to analyse it, or just having enough people to attend incidents, a divide grew between both groups. Staff became afraid, vulnerable prisoners became afraid, and as people metaphorically withdrew, that vacuum was filled with bullish, strong prisoners, often from organised crime gangs. We were moving towards prisons controlling the landings of our wings. Prison officers under law cannot strike, but they can withdraw to a place of safety if they believe their life is under threat. We saw this happen increasingly, and in many cases it was justified. Industrial relations were very tense across the estate. Bristol was the 4th prison I had governed, and I drew on every ounce of experience I had gained over 25 years in the service. Nothing I could do could make a difference. I had no staff. I had no money. I had a prison which was a filthy, rat-infested Victorian slum, and a facilities management contract which is incapable of improving it. I was unable to get kit for prisoners, and to this day I'm not sure why. I would order kit, it never turned up, or only 20% of the order arrived. It was probably the quality of the centralised procurement and contracts, but I really don't know why it was so difficult to get kit to my prison, and this was right across the entire estate. This was the most stressful and soul-destroying period of my career, as I watched my staff lose their confidence and prisoners' utter sense of hopelessness. Colleagues across England and Wales felt the same, and those who were around then and still around now suffer from a form of flashback and PTSD when the word benchmarking is ever mentioned. At around this time, a new workforce strategy was implemented called Fair and Sustainable. Its purpose to streamline and flatten management structures, reduce the costs of pay by lowering starting salaries, and the use of a job evaluation scheme to ensure fairness across pay structures and reduce equal pay claims. This, coupled with reform of pensions, made joining HMPS a far less attractive option, even if the recruitment tap was turned back on, which it was not for another 2 years. The legacy of this remains today. In May 2015, Michael Gove took up office. He was well known as a reformer while Secretary of State for Education, although his policies were divisive within that sector. Mr. Gove wanted to test his academy schools model in prisons. Several establishments across England and Wales were identified and began testing autonomy. Mr. Gove believed that prisons could become independent legal entities. Those working in prisons knew this could never be the case. As a national service, prisons rely on each other for operational stability and resilience. These pilots received some pump priming money, but the rest of the prison estate continued with the austerity measures, and the levels of violence, suicide and self-harm continued to rise. When Mr. Gove was replaced by Liz Truss, this ministerial priority stopped. Liz Truss took up office in 2016. She was the first Secretary of State during the decade who accepted prisons were in crisis and argued for extra funding for the beleaguered service. In November 2016, Prison Safety and Reform was published. It moved away from autonomy to empowerment of governors, once again claiming to remove bureaucracy and inefficiency. Ken Clarke promised the same in 2011 and Chris Grayling in 2013, and both failed miserably. This empowerment was seen as central to improving our prisons. We were now embarking on the reform agenda. 2,500 more prison officers were to be recruited, still far short of the 7,000 we'd lost over the previous 3 years. This trust decided to split operation delivery from policy. She confirmed that NOMS, National Offender Management Service, would be replaced by HMPPS, Her Majesty, His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, as part of this change, and the new executive agency was given full responsibility for all operations across prisons and probation, whilst the Ministry of Justice took the lead on commissioning services, policy development and setting standards. The Prison Safety and Reform Programme in the Ministry of Justice was led and predominantly run by generalist civil service, with little or no understanding of the very complex nature of prisons and their inhabitants. Like many wheels of bureaucracy, it was slow, cumbersome and unresponsive to the critical situations in our prisons. It was a machine requiring information and more information from an already stretched prison system. The feeding of the machine is taking leadership teams in prisons away from the job of improving their prisons and keeping prisoners safe and decent. The added frustration for governors was that nothing seemed to come back from the Ministry of Justice to improve their jails. Rather than feeling empowered, governors were feeling under more scrutiny than ever. Assurance seemed to be increasing, and they were still governing prisons while shackled by central bureaucracy. At this time, the Ministry of Justice moved to a functional model for delivering corporate services. This model groups specific specialisms or professions, in other words, finance, human resources, under a head of function. The function then works with the business area, prisons, that require them to deliver the services. Governors and their teams working in prisons universally hate this model. They find the service provided, particularly around finance and HR, is very poor, often with these professionals having little or no corporate knowledge of the complexities of prisons and their people. The risk remains with governors, but they struggle to manage it with such poor support. Frustration is palpable, and there is an absolute refusal by the civil service to change this unresponsive model. It did feel for a little while that the grown-ups had taken over private office with David Gork and the award-winning podcaster Rory Stewart, which I'm sure everybody has listened to his podcast. Mr. Gork's tenure from January 2018 to July 2019 seemed to promise a change in direction in sentencing. He made a very sensible speech in February 2019 talking about abolishing 6-month sentences because they didn't work and probably did more harm than good. Yahoo to that. Rory Stewart argued for a small amount of money to improve gate security and tested this in 10 prisons, which proved successful and reduced drugs and violence in all of them over a 12-month period. As it was successful, further funding was approved for rollout across all prisons. Where there is a will, there is a way. I felt these two politicians had a will. Unfortunately, their refusal to support Boris Johnson and a no-deal Brexit ended in them having the whip removed and kicked out of the party. What is interesting is that in recent weeks, the announcements from Alex Chalk seem to mirror some of David Gauke's February 2019 speech. Maybe if we'd implemented some of this stuff back then, we would not be in the mess we're in today. In 2020, a smarter approach to sentencing white paper was published by Robert Buckland, the then Justice Secretary. Without going into too much detail, this paper would lead to more people in prison and more people in prison for longer, despite there being no evidence that longer sentences make a difference to public safety. The impact for prisons was more overcrowding in an already stressed system, increasing the instability and safety concerns. And I will talk about how this has panned out in the last year slightly later in this lecture. For over 2 years, the country and prisons were in the grip of COVID. Very little has been said about how governors and their teams managed the pandemic, but I am shouting at the top of my voice when I tell you they were magnificent and a lesson across the entire public sector on how to manage risk, keep people safe and save lives. Predictions were that over 3,000 prisoners would die from the virus, and government were urged by health experts to reduce the population by thousands to manage this risk. Government responded by implementing an early release scheme. It was so stringent and risk-averse that in fact it released less than 30 prisoners. Governors and their teams were the hidden heroes of COVID and have never been given the public recognition they deserve for what they achieved. There were 159 prisoner deaths believed to be due to COVID, plus another 56 deaths due to other causes where COVID was present. Many of these deaths were in the second wave in winter 2020 to early 2021, when we had a more deadly transmissible variant and before vaccination coverage was widespread. Government, despite public health advice in the very closed environment of a prison, refused to give prison staff or prisoners priority for the vaccine. This decision was based on what public opinion would think, as opposed to what was the right thing to stop the spread of the virus within prisons and out into the wider community. That's my personal view. After all, prison officers were moving daily between the two, a sinful decision, in my opinion. In 2021, Dominic Raab, Justice Secretary, introduced another white paper, Prison Strategy. It all made sound common sense, and there was very little of the content which could be criticised, other than it probably lacked ambition. But the implementation and delivery of the paper is compromised due to the crisis currently facing our prisons. As an organisation, HMPPS is dependent on the activity of other organisations, including Police, Crown Prosecution Service and HM Courts and Tribunal Service, and the policies and objectives of the Ministry of Justice and Home Office to determine the demands on its service. HMPPS itself has little control over this demand. The government has known since 2020 that the prison population would rise exponentially this decade. This is driven by a range of factors, the government policy decisions, including an ongoing increase in the number of long sentences, the impact of continuing recruitment of more frontline police officers, and change into sentencing driving an increase in probation caseloads, and the increased demand for prison places and courts ramping up after the COVID lag. In response to this increase in demand, funding was secured at SR21 to deliver 20,000 extra prison places by the middle of the decade. As a result, government is currently embarking on the most ambitious portfolio of prison building in over a century to ensure there are enough places to accommodate those sentenced by the courts. We're now in the autumn of 2023, and as this government is in its twilight months, I just want to talk about where we are now and if you think it's been a success. I was utterly astonished to hear the current Secretary of State for Justice at his party conference last month state that government is looking at renting cells abroad. If this doesn't demonstrate a system which is completely broken, I don't know what does. To publicly state we're unable to look after our convicted citizens in their country is an admission of abject failure. The Ministry of Justice states that the facilities regime and rehabilitation must meet British standards. This is rather ironic, considering a German court in early September refused to extradite a man accused of drug trafficking because of the concerns about the prison conditions in Britain. Forget the morals and ethics of this suggested policy. Logistically, how do we maintain family ties? How do we deal with language barriers? How do we rehabilitate to return to the British community? How do we seek assurance that the care is equivalent? Will our prison rules apply to our citizens in these other jurisdictions? What will it cost the public purse? I doubt it will be cheaper than keeping them at home. And I'm sure you can think of many questions. The policy is so ridiculous and beyond the pale. It seems it is more about finding spaces and making a difference to prisoners' lives and risks and protecting the public. It is a headline-grabbing piece of nonsense requiring legislative changes, so not a short-term fix for our capacity crisis. I hope it will disappear into the annals of history, rather like the Rwanda policy. The prison population is risen by approximately 6,500 in a year, currently sitting at around 88,000, at a cost of £46,500 per prisoner per year. This is the highest prison population we've ever had. What a record to break. Ministry of Justice projections are that the population could reach 106,000 this decade. These are mind-boggling numbers to take in, especially as in March 2021, it stood at 78,000. We have a capacity build programme which has enabled to keep up demand, and we have planning permission for these large new behemoth prisons rejected for some sites. At best, this means there will be delay in building whilst appeals are lodged. At worst, they will never be built. And what does this mean for prison places? Once again, the latest Justice Secretary at his party conference peddled the well-used statement of increasing capacity and building 20,000 extra modern prison places, but failed to mention that none of our 150-year-old and in some cases younger, outdated, crumbling, not fit for purpose prisons will continue to be full, offering little benefit for those in them, those people living in them. Recent history has shown that large government infrastructure announcements fail to materialise or deliver on the scale promised. There is a potential for the prison capacity building programme to be a further example of this. The 3 proposed sites, which have failed to get planning permission, equates to approximately 5,000 spaces. It's not rocket science to see this as a cause for significant concern. Given the lack of connection between government departments, sentencing policy and public opinion, it's likely that 20,000 extra spaces will be insufficient. We're unable to recruit, develop and retain the staff we need to care for the current prisoner population. How on earth are we going to find the staff to open these new establishments when they get built? A number of which are in rural shires, which are expensive areas of the country. We're fishing in the same pond as the police and border force, who offer a far better, safer working environment with an improved development pay and reward package. The offer from HMPPS to new prison offers to recruits is a 6-week residential course at a cost of a mere £5,500. And following that, they're on the wings, carrying out what is possibly the most challenging role in the country. This is unacceptable, and governors are critical of the quality of some staff and the fact that they play no part in the recruitment process. They do not know who is going to walk through their gates until they see the whites of their eyes. These double whammy crises have been the only show in town. We stumble through each week in the hope that accommodation for new prisons, opening of refurbished wings and rapid deployment units will save us for another couple of weeks. We sit with our fingers crossed, hoping we will have seasonal dips in the population to survive another spike. We have a buffer zone of approximately 1,400 spaces to allow for unexpected accommodation issues, which is now used as business as usual. At the time of writing this speech, we have but a few hundred male adult spaces left, and this figure includes Cat D places not easily accessed. The women's population continues to grow, but there are little in the way of contingency plans for when these prisons are full. Women are the most vulnerable of cohorts, and to be locked out in police cells is very concerning. Prisons under the cosh, where once we would have reduced the population to help stabilise them, are now being asked to reopen this accommodation to meet the demand. The health and safety of those living and working in these prisons is secondary to the need for spaces. Violence and self-harm are on an upward trajectory, as is the presence of drugs and their associated risks. It seems a forlorn home to expect this pattern to change in the medium term because, as we all know, prisons, which are underfunded and full every day, are not calm, safe or decent places, let alone rehabilitative. It could be argued that the current operational capacity for some prisons is already too high. This is not how to run a vital public service. HMPPS coordinated response to overcrowding has been impressive and has to date prevented a complete collapse of the system. This does come at a cost. Far too much focus is given to capacity management, instead of a system-wide improvements and outcomes for prisoners. HMPPS has no say in how many prisoners are sent to its jails. Prisons are at the end of the road where all other interventions have failed. This crisis is not of their making, and there is only so much they can do without government's strategic intervention to reduce the prison population. Recently, Charlie Taylor, Chief Inspector of Prisons, publicly stated that 1 in 10 of our prisons should be closed, particularly old, crumbling Victorian prisons. If only that were a possibility, but it is not and probably will not be for many years. These unmaintained prisons, with decades of disinvestment, will remain in use and will only crumble further due to the demand for every single cell in England and Wales to be in use. Despite all this drama, HMPPS is expected to deliver £37 million in savings during the spend and review period. There is absolutely no hope of any of this being reinvested in the front line, which will have to continue delivering on a wing and a prayer. We're in a perfect storm scenario at present. Our prisons are full. The prison building programme cannot keep up pace with the increase in the prison population. A rigorous process was carried out in 2022 and again this year to look at the maximum number of prisoners any prison can hold to maintain decency, safety, order and control. This risk assess project was done by expert senior operational managers within His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, taking into consideration the uniqueness of each prison. This maximum number is called the operational capacity, and when filled, prison is full. And we're very grateful to our senior leaders who are holding that line. When a prison is at its operational capacity, it is full. We cannot put anybody else in. Currently, most of our prisons are full, and we've been using police cells for the overflow, although this has recently been stepped down. Where there are spaces, it has been in the low category open prisons. A piece of work has been conducted to maximise the use of open prisons, and these are now reaching their capacity, where once we would have risk assessed prisoners to transfer to open conditions, we now give presumptive Cap D, and we just wait and see what impact that might have on the stability of our Cap D prisons. There is no more room at the inn. This dangerous situation is due to reactive government policy, which has failed to ensure sufficient prison places for the demand they have created. The political rhetoric, rather than being tough on crime, has created a situation where further overcrowding will turn many of our prisons into little more than warehouses of despair, danger and degradation, despite the best efforts of governors and their teams. There is potential for staff to go to a place of safety again due to their health and safety being compromised. Government is failing both the people prisons hold and the community they serve. Fair and sustainable workforce strategy I spoke about earlier, which reduced the pay and reward package for prison officers, has had a long-term impact on recruitment and retention. The dangerous working environment coupled with this means we are far from being an employer of choice. Whilst pay and reward from the peer review body has improved the package, we still struggle to recruit despite a huge focus on this issue. The crisis in staffing has led to a situation where large numbers are sent on detached duty with potential for it to be compulsory across the country to try and shore up prisons where shortfalls are even worse. We know that staff-prisoner relationships are critical to stability, but with such a transient staffing situation, this is compromised. Austere regimes are delivered across a significant proportion of the estate due to lack of staff numbers to safely unlock prisoners. So in summary, prisons are a critical part of the criminal justice system. Their role in both punishment and rehabilitation needs to be effective in the overall aim of a system which reduces reoffending. Since 2010, 11 Justice Secretaries, one holding the post twice, and 13, as of a couple of weeks, it's now 14, prison ministers, one holding the post twice for one day, have through political buffeting and interference achieved nothing but decline in the function of prisons. The decision by government to impose eye-watering austerity on unprotected departments last decade resulted in a race to the bottom for many public services from which prisons have yet to recover. Ministry of Justice statistics over these years document record-breaking rises in violence, suicide and self-harm. Lack of investment in prison infrastructure has resulted in crumbling prisons, both Victorian and those of more recent construction. Slashing of pay and reward package of prison staff and failure to implement full recommendations from the prison service peer review body has resulted in a recruitment and retention situation never seen before in the service. Whilst in recent months, this is an improving picture, probably due to the kind of cost of living crisis, it is an ongoing gargantuan task encouraging people to join. This is all against a backdrop of an increase in the prison population. During this period, government published various strategies for change. This yo-yoing from one political priority to the next did nothing except destabilise prisons. None of these initiatives proved successful, and indeed some of them were catastrophic. Long-term failure still felt today, both for prisons, public safety and the public purse. In 2019, the populist rhetoric from the new government was a tough on crime agenda, 20,000 more police officers to find criminals, 20,000 more spaces in which to lock them up. In 2021, a further prison strategy white paper was published, the content of which is uncontroversial but not particularly ambitious. That said, even to deliver this paper requires a functioning prison system. Notwithstanding a pandemic impacting on the criminal justice system, the policy of locking up more people for longer and making it more difficult to be released requires a whole system approach, ensuring downstream can cope with such political decisions. Unfortunately, this has not been the case. Prisons are full and there are not enough cells for the prison population. The dialogue and rhetoric on prisons must change. A brave government needs to look at alternatives to prison and educate society. Being tough on crime is not always about putting more people in prison for longer. It is about doing the right thing to safeguard our communities from crime. When people end up in prison, everything else has failed. Education, health, drug and alcohol services, social services and many other interventions. Prison is now used to pick up the pieces of a failing society. Is the purpose of prison to educate the innumerate and illiterate? Is the purpose of prison to safeguard those with mental health issues? Is the purpose of prison to deal with drug and alcohol abuse? If it is, then we're not adequately funded for it and we're not very good at it. We have the same inspection criteria like Ofsted and CQC as those institutions that should be good at it, and this feels unfair. We're expected to be all things to everything, but in fact, we fail to excel in most things. It often feels like a forgotten service, but it's full of truly hidden heroes. We know that those working in prisons deliver a vital role, which requires a multitude of skills, carried out with a sense of pride and commitment, but it is tough. Governors and their staff do not get the recognition they deserve. Finally, sometimes out of crisis or adversity, there may be positives. Government has allowed our prisons to overcrowd and then some, and the knock-on negative impact this has had on safety and decency. But finally, they've had to react. Alex Chalk gave a speech to Parliament on the 16th of October, and whilst much of it was the same rhetoric I've heard many times over the years, there were some positives that stood out to me. And I'm sure these decisions were forced on government by their own policies, which increased the prison population to breaking point, and not ones they would readily choose to take. However, implementing an early custody licence in a limited number of prisons, increasing lengths of HDC for some prisoners, challenging the judiciary to look at alternatives to custody, and delisting cases for a period of time has given respite and a few hundred extra spaces. Not much, I know, and how long a reprieve it gives the services probably into the early spring of next year. Those working in prisons know that there's very little they can do for short-term sentenced offenders, and the same faces return to their local prison time and time again. Invariably, we manage to stabilise them from drugs and alcohol and signpost them to whatever immediate intervention they require if available, and little else. The standout announcement for me in his speech was this. He stated, Alex Chalk, "We will legislate for a presumption the custodial sentence of less than 12 months in prison will be suspended and offenders will be punished in the community instead. If this comes to fruition, then I will go to my retirement on the 31st of March next year, happy that a long-held view and mandate from the Prison Governors Association has finally been realised." Thank you.
Yeah. Angelo, if you could move the camera. Are you there, Angelo? Yes, here we go. Sorry, this is for the online people. Do we have, thank you very much, Andrea, for that ramp through everything that's gone wrong for the last 14 years. But there was a lot in there that provides context for all of the Howard League's work. And I should have said at the beginning that with her many hats on, one of Andrea's hats rather, is as a member of the Council of the Howard League, which is a new initiative of advisors to support our work. And so we're really grateful for her contribution in that respect. Do we have questions? Oh gosh, we have too many questions. I'm going to go first of all to Ben Leitman from Inside Time.
Thank you. Ben Leitman, Inside Time. In February, you wrote to Dominic Raab on behalf of PGA about the capacity crisis. And you said that there had been this review of capacity in 2022, which had identified extra places. You said that the PGA supported that increase after receiving assurances that the total increased total capacity was a red line, which would not be crossed. You've revealed, I think, today that there was another review similar to this year, which I haven't been aware of. But you said at that time that we want to put you on notice that any increase in capacity beyond the 2020 review is likely to result in overcrowding to unsafe levels, including risk to prisoners and members alike. In the event of such an increase, we'll take legal advice with a view to immediate legal action. This afternoon, I looked at the operational capacities of all the prisons and how they've changed since February when you wrote that letter and now. And the operational capacity has increased to 48 prisons by a total of more than 1,000, not counting the two prisons. And prisons like Nottingham, Birmingham, Liverpool, Pentonville, Brixton all had their op caps increased, even though I'm not aware of any expansion. So hasn't the red line been breached? And did you take the legal advice and did it result in legal action?
Okay, so the prisons that you're referring to, the operational capacity could mean that they've had their operational capacity reduced because of refurbishment work. We've had a lot of fire safety work being done around our prisons because, believe it or not, we still use domestic fire alarms in some of our prisons. And so there's been quite a bit. So when the operational capacity is being reduced and then it is back, it's increased when a wing reopens, that's where the operational capacity has moved. So, you know, we're comfortable with reopening of refurbished accommodation. The red line, as far as we're concerned, our senior leaders, Amy Rees and Phil Coppell, have been very clear that the agreed operational capacity of every prison will not be increased, and it hasn't been increased. We did seek legal advice. You are correct. We spoke to a KC, but we haven't had to do anything with that legal advice, but we did seek it. But I'm not going to share that in this meeting.
Least of all with somebody who's a journalist. Gentlemen.
Thank you for your talk. I think sort of the subtext which I got from it was this cultural shift from of the society, from pandering to the public to, as opposed to a framework of what is right and wrong, what is sinful and what is graceful. Said that the system was broken, and in the context it sounded like you were referring to the prison system. But I mean, it seems to me a Nietzschean idea of God is dead and we have killed him. That the reason that's the shift away from the secularization of the society and the idea that of the whole reformation of people, of humans, comes from the Christian tradition of you know, that we can all be made new and we're all worthy of forgiveness. And so, and you talked about what is the role of the prisons, and the gospel. I'm about practicing Catholic. The gospel for Sunday was about feeding the hungry and clothing the poor, and this shift away from the Christian framework, the Christian morality. It seems that your experience in the last 13 years is a result from that.
So, a question, sir.
So my question is, what impact do you think an investment in the chaplaincy services would have, and how has your faith impacted your career? And have you noticed a impact of officers who are religious in their work.
Before you answer, I realised that the people online I don't think can hear you. So the gentleman's asked the role of the chaplaincy, investment in the chaplaincy, and the role of faith in prisons, but also more broadly, I guess, in the rehabilitation, reintegration.
The three questions that you've asked, the last two, I'm not going to be able to answer. So, you know, the faith of prison officers, I wouldn't necessarily know the faith of prison officers, and it's not really for me to share my faith with anybody in this room. So, but the first one about chaplaincy, I think chaplaincy are absolutely critical in prisons. You know, the not just for kind of support of prisoners, the support that they give staff, and me personally, when I was Governor of Bristol, I had a brilliant chaplain who was my sounding board and somebody who I dumped all of my stresses onto. But you know, it's not just that they deliver kind of the faith side of things, it's all that pastoral stuff, and that just being kind of there and non-judgmental. So for me, you know, if we invest in chaplaincy, it could only be positive in prisons, whatever faith people are.
So a question, yes, sir. Yes, you.
Hey?
Yep.
Oh, hi, it's Rob Allen here. I'm an independent researcher. Thanks very much, Andrea. Pretty depressing, but encyclopedic. One thing, you may have mentioned it, but I think I missed it, was the escape from Wandsworth in September, which was a kind of a bit of a disaster. Have you any hope that the independent investigation that has been commissioned by Mr. Chalk, what happened there, might bring some sense in terms of staffing levels and so on?
So this is a question about the impact of the Wandsworth escape.
Well, I can't really comment on an ongoing investigation into prison, and clearly the leadership team there are members, so I won't be talking about the specifics of that. But you know, anything that investigates any issues in our prisons, if it identifies risk, and if that's staffing numbers or whatever it might be, then clearly, you know, we would want there to be a reaction to that. We don't have enough staff. You know, it's ridiculous that you were unlocking a wing with 250 prisoners and there might be 3 staff on there. You know, and these are highly vulnerable prisoners. You know, these are, you know, prisons are dangerous places. You know, we have to be quite honest there. And, you know, you need staff there to build up the relationships, to be able to see what's happening, to make places safer. And who knows, you know, just as an example, if there had been sufficient staff on the wings in Wandsworth Prison, maybe there would have been intelligence that might have told people things. Who knows? But I'm not really going to comment on Wandsworth.
I'm going to go before John. We'll go to a couple of questions from online. So Nishma Moroni says, it seems that the prison system has become the end point of a very blunt instrument. What would you like to see change at the other end that you think would make a real difference?
I think if you're spending you know 46,500, and that's just an average, you know, Cat C prisoner. If you're spending that money at the end, you know, when everything else has failed, then surely we have to change that around and reduce the prison population. And I'm no expert in these things, you know, I'm an expert about prisons, but surely, you know, we need to reduce the prison population and invest that into communities and into youth services and into health and into education, into everything that you need to do to prevent people coming into prison. To me, it's like just sound common sense. It's
the Howard League. But Andrea's loud. No, we didn't think it too. The next question is specific but timely for today, given that there's been an announcement of a change to the licence period for IPP prisoners, which is from Melanie, saying, how do governors cope with demoralised and desperate IPP prisoners? You must have seen a lot of them in your time.
Yeah. I suppose governors have to cope as they would with any prisoner who feels like that. We have a mandate from our members that, you know, to re-sentence IPP prisoners. You know, we have to do that, and they haven't gone far enough with that decision. You know, we have high levels of self-harm and suicide among the IPP prisoners. and governors just have to try and manage that risk the best they can with whatever tools they've got. But the risk is there, and it's a very high risk, you know, because if people lose the sense of hope, then what have we got, really?
John Samuels.
John Samuels, for me, the most relevant phrase in your wonderful address was educate society.
Yeah.
It was said to me earlier today, my friend Rob Allen, why is it that you're the only judge, ex-judge, who we see at events like this? Why is it that I have been going into custodial establishments trying to promote the interests of judicial monitoring and supervision for 20 years? It may be that I'm just unpersuasive. But my question to you, Andrea, is simply this. Is there any restriction on prison governors which precludes them from actively inviting both sentencers, that is magistrates and crown court judges, and local members of parliament routinely to visit the prisons where they operate?
No.
And if not, why don't they?
So the question is from John Samuels, asking whether prison governors, is there anything stopping prison governors inviting sentencers, i.e. people who give sentences out, and who's the other people?
Members of Parliament.
Members of Parliament into prisons? No.
No, and governors do. Governors do invite, and people, you know, the people that you've mentioned do come into the prison. Certainly when I was governor of all the prisons that I've governed, I've had MPs come, I've had all sorts of people come and visit.
And judges?
Well, we used to have magistrates used to come in, but I didn't. I suppose, you know, if I'm honest, John, you know, a governor in a busy, you know, prison, you know, finding the time to be sending invites out to people, it's probably not on the top list of priorities at the minute. But if somebody was to send them a letter in or contact them and say, we'd like to come and have a look round, I'd be incredibly surprised if the governor didn't say, please come and have a look round.
Elsa.
Slight devil's advocate question here.
Oh, thank you, Elsa.
Although I will mention that I don't know if you're aware that the court still had a second reading today and the short sentence with the net but equally around the transfer, so double-edged on that one. But anyway, my question is, so I had a conversation with a significant stakeholder recently who expressed the opinion that while in the user state the cost per place is substantially higher than at the adult prisons, the standards are not a great deal better. And if it was primarily down to cost and resource, then we would see significantly higher standards within the youth estate, and we don't. So essentially, the resourcing point is doing a lot of legwork, but actually there's something more. I just want to understand what your response is.
I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what you're saying, Elsa. I'm sorry.
I think the point really is perhaps that we used to have a lot of people in the children's estate, and now that's gone down, and yet
no. So the point is that
it's expensive.
Place,
it's £350,000
exactly
a child.
Now, presumably that means that more money is being spent on them, and therefore the conditions in the estate would be much better than in the adult prisons. But that's also not the reality.
When you're referring to conditions, are you referring to the infrastructure of the prisons, or are you just talking about just generally the offer to youngsters? Is that,
this was a general statement. So I can't remember.
I think at one point we had about 3,000 children in prison. I think it's reduced to 500. I think those figures are roughly right. But the 500 that are now in prison are probably the most challenging people we've got. You know, high propensity to violence and such like. They're very damaged children, so they're going to be more challenging. I think the environment, the actual physical environment. You know, a lot of these places are not built, they're not child friendly. We have quite large units, you know, they're not like small, you know, 5 or 6, you know, children together. You know, some of them, you know, particularly in Wetherby, they've got some big units, you know, Cookham Wood, you know, a lot of them are purpose built for children. So, you know, like a lot of the prison estates is not fit for 2024. Our prison officers who work in in the youth estate are better trained to deal with children, but they are not like social workers. They're not trained to that standard. They're just, so, you know, I think the issue is we've got, you know, the 500 that are left are probably the most challenging. The environment's not as good as it should be, and we don't train our people sufficiently to deal with such damaged people or children, I think.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
Hi, Milos Bruski. I've got a question about.
How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for being here and sharing us your knowledge, Andrea. I've got a question that I hope you can help me to answer, because I asked it to myself quite a bit and I cannot find the answer. It's related to the previous question about educating society, and the question is, what's British public actually ready for in terms of criminal justice reform? Because you mentioned, you know, the 12-month sentence reform, and, you know, many politicians, and we couldn't blame, possibly, pragmatically speaking, politicians for caring about what they think the voters would say, right? But it doesn't seem that there was much of a backlash against that decision. So perhaps ministers could conclude that such decision that could previously be seen as controversial is not controversial, and there's a room for further decisions like this. So I wonder whether you believe that those decisions could be, what those ideas around prison reform we may want to see going forward that would actually be acceptable politically in the near future.
there's a question about public's appetite for change, really.
I think you're right. I think the announcements by Alex Chalk, you know, we didn't get the usual media scrum around the 12 months. So, you know, maybe there is more of an appetite than you say. But I suppose, you know, the minute we have, you know, serious further offences or probation can't supervise the people who, you know, the 12 months or less, you know, not going into custody, then you could just imagine it would be reversed like that, because there'd be a public outcry, wouldn't there? So I think it's quite tentative. I think we need to see how it goes. I was quite interested. I was at the given evidence at the Justice Committee on the capacity issues last week, and one of the MPs who was asking me questions gave me some data that in 2007, when the Labour government began an 18-day early custody licence, and I've forgotten how many thousands of people were released, that actually the reoffending rate was only 3%, or the offending rate whilst they're out on early custody licence. So this it works, you know, these things work, you know. You know, my personal view is we have far too many people on remand. We need to use more technology to keep people out of remand. You know, people on remand for such a long period of time now that when they go to court, they're released from court with no resettlement things in place. You know, and you know, is it any wonder that they end up reoffending and coming back into our care? So for me, you know, I think there's the use of technology, and you know, I know it would take a brave politician to stand up and say we've got to reduce the prison population, but they have to be brave. They have to do it, because what we're doing in prison, it's a myth. It's a myth that we're being tough on crime, and that myth's being perpetuated by government. So I suppose, you know, it's tentative steps. You know, Alex Chalk has made those first few steps, and let's see how it goes. But, you know, we always know that when something goes wrong, there's always an extreme reaction to it, isn't there? So that's just my concern. I don't know if I answered your question, Mosh, but
yeah, I think so.
No, I've been asking myself once.
I was interviewed last week by Politico for a podcast coming up, Westminster Insider, and I think it's coming out in a couple of weeks' time. But Alex Chalk was interviewed for this, and he actually was asked this question around, you know, what do you do when you're pursuing policy that's not necessarily popular? And I will let him tell you how he responded to that. But I thought it was interesting and a little bit surprising. So here we go. It's a taster for you. One more question. Any more questions from the audience? Yes, two more questions very quickly. John, and then the gentleman at the very back.
Thanks very much for a really interesting talk. I'm John Collins from the Prisons Education Trust. I think it's broadly recognised now that education in prison is not great. A few years ago, Sally Coates was asked a review, I think, when Michael Gove was Secretary of State. And one of her sort of key proposals was to give prison governors more control over education in their prison and more responsibility for it as part of the broader move towards governor autonomy. I was wondering, that never really happened. I was wondering if you think prison governors would welcome that, and if not, what you think would improve prison education.
The question about prison education and governing.
I think governors, if governors are given any kind of autonomy, then they're always grateful for that, because, you know, we are a kind of centralised organisation, and obviously education contracts are centralised. I think education is a really difficult thing, because, you know, we're dealing with, you know, a lot of people who've been excluded from school, who the whole thing of education is just a complete turn off. It's just, and we don't exactly provide environments that are conducive to education that people want to go to. You know, I know it's changed, but when I was governor of Bristol, I had a horrible porta cabin that was condemned, that was about 30 years old, that leaked, was too hot in the summer, was too cold in the winter, and nobody wanted to go to it. Is there any wonder that, you know, yeah, I failed miserably on education? So I think it's about, I do think it's about governors having more autonomy. They know their prisons. You know, what we do in a prison is got, you know, our remand prison, or our local prisons, reception prisons as they're called now, you know, with the capacity issues that we've got and the population issues, they hold at 80% remands, you know, 80% remands, you know, and those 80% remands are not in a good place. And to try and get them into the headspace of actually making the effort to try and educate themselves, you know, whatever. So I think there's got to be an acknowledgement that education in prisons, don't compare it to education out in the community, because it's completely different. And so, you know, yeah, if governors were able to, you know, look at their cohort of prisoners, change, adapt, move things around instead of having rigid contracts, I think that would be a good thing. But it's very difficult to say what's needed in prisons, because I think it's very prison specific.
And there was a hand at the very, very back, which will be our last question of the day. Was there a was it? Yeah, if you had a hand up and you're at the back. Yes, perfect.
I heard what you said about them. Obviously, I agree that the death rates in prisons were far lower than people feared at the outset. But I do think there's an important point about the conditions for prisoners during the reduced regime that was approved.
Yeah.
I wonder what, if anything, governments learn from that, and are there preparations going into, if a future pandemic were to strike, how things might be managed differently, for not necessarily the death rate, but for the conditions for those who are serving sentences?
Do you know, I think that's quite an interesting question. I think it's quite a difficult one to answer. You know, I can't actually see you. Oh yeah.
Sorry.
The prisons, you know, they are just full of people in very, very close confines. And so, to be quite honest, the only way we could keep people safe was austere regimes, was locking down, you know, just keeping people in small cohorts, having purple visits so they could, you know, they could see their family via video link and things like that. There was nothing else we could do. And we had a government that really did nothing to help us. You know, they wouldn't release prisoners so we could have less overcrowding. They wouldn't prioritise prisoners for vaccines. That was government decision. And so that was government's decision. Prison governors and HMPPS just had to deal with what they had, which was nothing really to help and support them. And I suppose, you know, governors learn things, you know, we need less people in prison. And if there's another pandemic, we need to reduce the population in prison. But that's not within the gift of governors. They can't do it. And if there is another pandemic and people have to be isolated, then what we did is probably what we'll do again, because there's nothing else we could do. There's nothing else we could do unless we have a government that acknowledges the risk in prisons and the need to deliver a better, I suppose, a better pandemic life in prisons. But that's not within the gift of governors. I need to be really clear there. They cannot change. They had to do what they had to do in prisons, because that was what NHS and Public Health, or UK Health Security Agency, whatever you call them now, told them they had to do, and that's what they had to do. So, you know, if you think that governors and HMPPS had autonomy on this, they didn't. They had to follow the rules, and that was the only way they could follow the rules, because the same rules applied in prisons and applied in the community.
Can I please ask you all to put your hands? There'll be an opportunity for more questions. My apologies to those people online who haven't had a chance to answer their questions. There'll be a chance for the people in the room to ask Andrea questions over a drink outside. Can I please ask you to put your hands together for a fantastic lecture? With my thanks again to Aitken for hosting us today. If you're a member of the Howard League, please join us for our members meeting next Tuesday lunchtime, where we'll talk about how the Howard League's responding to these crises and our observations on that. If you're not a member of the Howard League, then what are you doing? Join. And I look forward to having a chat outside. Thank you very much. Well done. That was Thank you, everyone online.
I was going to say hello to my watch.
Have a good evening.
Yeah.